Look up at any old cathedral, any old courthouse, any old university tower built before 1900. You will see a spire, maybe two, maybe a dozen. They reach into the sky for no good reason. They serve no structural purpose. They cost a fortune to build. And every textbook tells you the same thing. They were religious. They pointed toward heaven. They were symbols of faith. But here is the part nobody wants to explain. Why do so many old photographs show those same spires with their tips cut off? Not damaged, not weathered, cut, clean, removed, and replaced with strange caps, plain crosses, or nothing at all. Why did entire cities all around the world perform the same surgery on their tallest structures at roughly the same window in history? Why does no historian want to talk about it? And why, when you actually study what these spires were made of, where they were placed, and what surrounded them, do they look less like religious ornaments and more like something else entirely? They look like antennas. Before we go deeper, hit subscribe so you do not miss the next part of this investigation. There are more chapters of the old world coming, and this story only makes sense when you see them stacked together. Now, let us begin. To understand what a spire actually is, you have to forget what you were taught. A spire is not a decoration. A spire is a precision-engineered structure made of very specific materials placed in a very specific location at a very specific height. Copper sheathing, iron framework, often gold leaf at the very tip, sometimes a crystal or quartz element underneath, and almost always a long central rod running down through the inside of the building into the ground. Now stop and think about that combination. Copper conductor on the outside, iron core for structure, a grounded rod running deep into the earth. This is the exact recipe for a receiver, or a transmitter, or both. In conventional history, you were told this design was about lightning. The spire was a lightning rod. Benjamin Franklin invented it in 1752, and the world followed. That is the story. But it collapses the moment you check dates. Cathedrals across Europe had copper and iron spires with grounded central rods centuries before Franklin was born. And the lightning rod explanation does not address why the materials get more elaborate as you go higher. Why the tip itself was often gold, why crystal was sometimes embedded inside. Why entire networks of these structures were built in straight lines across cities, all at similar heights, all pointing up. If they were only lightning rods, one per city would do. Instead, we see hundreds, sometimes thousands. In some old cities, every major building had one, including buildings that had no roof to protect, pavilions, arches, standalone columns. So what were they actually for? The Tartarian theory, the one mainstream historians refuse to engage with, suggests these spires were part of a global energy system, a network that pulled atmospheric electricity from the sky, channeled it through the materials inside the spire, and either stored it, transmitted it, or distributed it to the building below. In this theory, the old cities of the world were not running on oil or coal in the way we are told. They were running on wireless power, free energy, drawn from the atmosphere itself. And the spire was the visible part of that system, the receiver, the antenna. If that sounds insane, you should know that this is exactly what Nikola Tesla was working on at the turn of the 20th century. Wardenclyffe Tower on Long Island was built specifically to transmit electrical power through the atmosphere using a tall structure with a grounded central rod and a metal cap. Tesla wrote in his own papers that he was reverse engineering older systems. He believed the technology had existed before. He believed the Earth itself could be used as a conductor. And then his funding was cut, his tower was demolished in 1917, and his papers were seized by the United States government after his death in 1943. To this day, large portions of those papers remain classified. So we have a known inventor working in living memory who said he was rebuilding an older atmospheric energy system. We have thousands of structures across the world that match the exact specifications such a system would require. And we have a strange historical blackout around the question of who built these structures, when, and why. That alone should make you curious. But the strangest part of this story is what happened next. Starting in the late 1800s and continuing through the mid-1900s, something began happening to spires all over the world. They were being modified, The tips were removed, the decorative finials, the metal caps, the gold-leafed pinnacles, all coming off. In photograph after photograph, you can see the before and after. A church in Boston with a soaring metallic spire in 1885. The same church in 1925 with the top sawed off and replaced with a simple wooden cross. A courthouse in Berlin with an elaborate copper antenna in 1890. The same courthouse in 1930 with a plain stone cap. A grand exhibition hall in Chicago covered in glittering pinnacles in 1893. Demolished entirely by 1900. This was not random damage, this was not weathering, this was a coordinated, global, systematic removal. And nobody can give you a straight answer about why. The official explanations, when historians bother to give them, are always the same handful of excuses. The spires were too expensive to maintain, they were unsafe, they were damaged in storms, they were lost to fires, they were replaced during renovations. Individually, each explanation sounds reasonable, but when you start counting, the numbers do not add up. Tens of thousands of spires, modified or removed, across dozens of countries, during roughly the same 100-year window, and in nearly every case the modification removed the most electrically active part of the structure. The tip, the metal, the grounding connection. If you wanted to disable a network of atmospheric energy receivers without drawing attention, this is exactly how you would do it. You would not demolish the buildings, that would be too obvious. You would simply remove the working parts. The general public would never notice, the buildings would still stand, the spires would still be there, they would just no longer do what they were designed to do. Consider what we know about the late 1800s. This was the period when industrial energy companies were just being formed. Standard Oil, General Electric, Westinghouse. Massive amounts of money were being invested in building out coal infrastructure, oil pipelines, and copper wire electrical grids. The business model required customers who had to pay for energy. A pre-existing wireless system that pulled power from the atmosphere for free would be an existential threat to that entire industry. Removing it would not be optional. It would be a survival requirement for the new energy economy. And this is exactly when the tips started coming off. Look at the photographic record. In 1880, you can find clear images of cities like Paris, London, New York, St. Petersburg, and Vienna absolutely covered in spires. Every block has at least one. Many blocks have several. By 1950, that number has been reduced by more than 90% in most cities. Where did they go? Who removed them? Under whose authority? And why, when you look up the records of these removals, do you find vague references to renovations, maintenance, and modernization, but never a clear technical explanation of what was actually taken down? Even more strange is what happened to the buildings that lost their spires entirely. Many of them began to function differently. Hospitals famous for their healing rates suddenly became ordinary hospitals. Universities that had been centers of brilliance and innovation became ordinary universities. Concert halls celebrated for their otherworldly acoustics began to sound like every other concert hall. It is as if the buildings themselves had been doing something that they could no longer do once the spires were modified. The mainstream view is that this is all coincidence, confirmation bias, people romanticizing the past, but the patterns are too consistent to ignore. The same building materials, the same heights, the same grounding systems, the same coordinated removal, the same loss of function. Across thousands of structures, dozens of countries in the same compressed historical window. Now let us talk about what survived. Because not all of the old spires were modified. A few escaped, mostly in small towns, mostly in remote regions, mostly in places that were not connected to the new industrial energy grid in the early 20th century. And in those places you can still see what an original spire looked like. Copper sheathing all the way to the tip. Crystal inserts, gold-leafed pinnacles, full grounding rods, untouched. When researchers have measured the electromagnetic fields around these surviving spires, they have found something interesting. The fields are not flat. They are not what you would expect from a passive piece of architecture. There are measurable variations in the atmosphere directly above and around them. subtle electrical activity that does not occur around comparable modern buildings. Now, mainstream science has explanations for these readings: air movement, temperature differentials, equipment error, but the readings exist, and they are reproducible, and they only show up around the spires that were never modified. There is also the question of placement. The old spires were not scattered randomly across cities, they were positioned. When you plot the locations of the original spires on a map of any major old world city, lines appear, straight lines connecting one structure to the next, often running for miles. Some researchers have compared these lines to the ley lines described in older folk traditions. Others have compared them to the grids used in modern radio networks. Either way, the placement is deliberate. The spires were nodes, each one connected to the next, each one part of a larger pattern that only makes sense if these structures were communicating with each other. Even the heights tell a story. The old spires followed a narrow range, regardless of which country they were built in or which culture supposedly built them. The same proportions kept showing up in Italy, Russia, France, the United States, Mexico, India, and China. As if every culture on Earth had independently decided spires needed to be a specific height, or as if every one of these structures had been built by a single global civilization following a single technical specification. There is one more piece of this puzzle that almost nobody talks about. The mud floods. In the same century that the spire tips were being removed, cities all over the world were buried in unexplained layers of sediment. Buildings that had been 3 stories tall in 1850 had their ground floors converted to basements by 1900. Doorways that had been at street level were now below ground. Decorative features that had been at eye level were now hidden behind dirt. Where did all of this material come from? Mainstream history offers vague answers about urban renewal and street raising, but the records of these massive earth-moving operations are strangely thin for events that supposedly affected almost every major city on the planet. What if the mud floods and the spire removals were part of the same operation? What if a global event, whether natural, engineered, or some combination of both, buried the lower portions of the old world while another phase of the same operation disabled the upper portions? The lower halves of the buildings hidden under dirt, the upper halves of the buildings stripped of their working parts, the middle remains visible. The before and after are erased, and the story we are told about who built these structures and what they were for becomes the only story available. It is worth asking who benefits from this version of history. The energy companies that replaced wireless power with metered power, the governments that needed populations dependent on centralized infrastructure, the historians whose careers depend on the conventional timeline, the institutions that would have to admit they had been wrong for a century if any of this turned out to be true. None of them have any reason to investigate. All of them have reason to keep the questions buried. But the buildings are still here, the photographs are still here, the patterns are still here, the materials in the surviving spires are still here, and the technical specifications of what these structures actually were are still verifiable by anyone willing to look. The next time you walk past an old church, an old courthouse, or an old university, look up. Look at the spire. Look at the tip. Look at whether it ends in a clean point or in an awkward stump capped with something that does not match the rest of the structure. Look at the material. Is it copper? Is it iron? Is it gold-leafed? Or has it been replaced with something simpler, something cheaper, something that no longer conducts? You are looking at evidence of a global modification, a coordinated effort to disable a system that the official history says never existed. Whoever they were, the people who built the old world built it for a reason. And whoever came after, the people who modified it for a reason too. Both groups went to extraordinary lengths. Both groups left their fingerprints all over our cities. Both groups remain hidden behind vague explanations, missing records, and historians who refuse to ask the obvious questions. The spires were never religious, they were antennas, and someone somewhere decided that we were not supposed to know.